Welcome to another episode of Love Selling, Hate Sales. Oftentimes in sales, we think about selling a hard product or oftentimes software sales, but there's a whole other side of the spectrum when you think about selling professional services and consulting. This whole month, we're doing a series on the difference of selling services, consulting, and oftentimes selling those things in the software landscape. And one of the interesting things about selling services is oftentimes people do it so much different than the way they sell software. But there's some value in the repeatability that's created by selling software. There's some value in the ARR model of having that repeatable revenue that builds a solid base of cash flow for an organization. So today I'm joined by Justin Gray, who was the founder and CEO of LeadMD, which was acquired in 2001 by an organization called Trendline Interactive, and he's the current Chief Commercial Officer. And we're going to talk a little bit about what it takes to build a professional services and consulting business and what are the keys to making it successful. And no surprise here, we're going to talk quite a bit about sales. So Justin, thanks for joining the show.
Dude, Josh, you're really good at this, man. I love that intro.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the vote of confidence. This is also the guy that's written my paycheck for the last 8 years. So
I guess you'll get another one next week.
Yeah,
congrats.
I'm still on the payroll. Fantastic. So, listen, you started a services business in 2009?
Correct.
And it was based around implementing Marketo, if I remember correctly.
Originally, we were trying to both sell Marketo licenses and wrap services around it. But yes, very quickly, it became a services-only business.
And if I remember, these are the early days. So before I even came on board, one of the challenges with selling Marketo was that they had built such an engine.
Well, yeah, they had a ton of VC money behind them, right? And so tons of channel conflict. They didn't really understand the channel business they were trying to build. They understood they wanted one,
right.
But really the definition was pretty blurry. So every time that we engaged with a client, they'd obviously already been to the Marketo website, they'd seen online demos or registered for it in person, and that was then their lead. So things got pretty choppy pretty quickly, especially since we were driving in essentially the same market. So it just made made sense to pivot into a service-based business, because that's really where the market demand was at that time. Everything was so immature. Marketing software was largely not a thing. Prior to that, it was CRM and ESP. And so there was just a huge deficit in terms of skill set. So that was a pretty attractive deficiency for us.
So then what did you have to learn? You think about this organization that you're essentially partnering with is driving all this demand. You can't essentially keep a lead for selling the software, but did that teach you anything about how you might have to drive demand for your own business, for this services organization?
Certainly. I think, just a long string of lessons on the same topic, which is don't fight the market. The market defines what they want to buy. And I've said many times, I don't want to re-educate the market, at least not at the, where we think about a normal sales conversation taking place. You can expand on that understanding, or kind of, that 1 degree of change at that point can lead to big change down the road. But largely, I don't want to fight the battle of, you wanted to buy A, I'm going to go sell you Z, right? I'm happy to sell you A, B, or C, that, in a closer proximity, I guess I would say.
It was interesting as you thought about driving demand, and you have both a sales and a marketing background, right? Mm-hmm. So where did you over-index in the early days, and when did you think, okay, now it's time to insert a real sales motion into this business?
Well, from very early on, I wanted to bring so it's kind of important that we probably back up. I do not have a services-based background. If you look at most founders of consultancies or agencies, there's a really predominant maturity curve there. Normally someone worked for either client side, and then they essentially started servicing that same client, right? So I worked for AT&T for 20 years, and then I became the agency for AT&T. Or they worked at a large holding company or a large consultancy, and they wanted to kind of hang their own shingle. Neither one of those paths looked like my path, right? So we started from zero day one. It was the idea of, wow, this is really innovative software, which is kind of funny to say about marketing automation these days, certainly given the state of the market. But during that day, there was no lead scoring, there was no automation based on segments, there was no nurture, all these things I stumbled upon, quite frankly, and then got really immersed in trying to make that work for the business that I was operating in at the time, and was just totally taken aback by how few resources there were for an end user of that particular platform. I mean, I won't go into all the details, but like literally you were sitting on, I think, 3 different calls, like 1, 2, 3, with an enablement or customer success individual with 25 other people that had bought within the last 2 weeks that you did, and answering questions. It was like, things would get all down one, the loudest squeaky wheel essentially got the grease. You're trying to figure out the super complex platform that has a ton of potential, and it's just being dealt with in a super ad hoc manner. There was no like, this is what this solution looks like when it's fully mature. And even today, people struggle with that type of vision, right? But in those days, it was I could not believe how powerful the software was and how anemic the resources were to take full advantage of it. So that's certainly what sparked the idea. Like, can we get a wider base of exposure to the software, and can we give people what they need? Which it's not, earth-shattering that that's the side of the business that took off, because that's what people were starving for. Like the software, they can easily procure that somewhere else, but they couldn't procure the services to support it. And so that's ultimately what drove the focus of the business.
Interesting. Well, a little tangent for a story here. It's funny that you mentioned the lead scoring didn't exist, nurturing didn't exist, none of those things. So Justin and I had actually reconnected, I want to say 2006, 2007-ish.
Yep.
You were running a payment processing business.
Yep.
I was working in an e-learning business. There was some mutual interest in how we might work together. We wound up doing that. And then after our lunch, and after I think we got a deal done on the other thing, I start getting these cryptic emails from Justin with screenshots with the activity I was doing on his website, with this scoring model that was happening and this and that. And finally, I texted him or called him. I was like, what the hell are you sending me? He's like, dude, you need to take a look at this. So all right, fine. So I come down, I take a look at this Marketo platform, which, like you said, it was completely innovative at that time. And I wound up implementing Marketo and Salesforce with Justin in the early days of services. I think I was one of the early white label people.
Correct.
Yeah. So I was on
Yeah, we were still doing that business model when we sold you.
Yeah, it was wild. So, at that time, I'm one of the very early power users of Marketo, oddly enough, and I can still speak to it.
In a sales role, right? Like
right.
It kind of speaks to how starved the market was just to do things that we view as fundamental today, right? Like I just want to get some messaging in front of these folks that's relevant.
Yeah, it was super interesting. And then, so you fast forward a few years, I get a text from you saying, hey, I need someone who understands this stuff to come sell it. Are you interested?
Mm-hmm.
So how did we get to that point? What happened in between?
So, yeah, interesting. I haven't really thought about this through that angle. But so, like I said, super focused on having a sales organization as part of this. If probably for no other reason initially, that's what I was comfortable with, right? Like I operated in software, I'd operated in merchant processing. And so we always had sales teams. And so the B2B sales motion was like second nature. And I looked at the landscape of the other folks that were doing, similar types of services, and there weren't a lot back then. But I saw that as an area that they were deficient in, right? Like they weren't running a really mature sales motion. So I definitely, was growth oriented, wanted to hit big bookings numbers, and I viewed having an inside sales team as a critical factor there. So the first year of what was mass impact back then, marketing as a service impact, I brought in 2 of the most hardcore sales folks that I knew from a previous life, and we just fell on our faces. Like literally for 9 months, I don't think we signed one deal. And great guys, literally could sell, I thought, ice to Eskimos at that point. But it was a totally different buyer than we were used to historically. And so all those tactics and, we did a lot of Sandler in those days and just a lot of sales methodology driven stuff. And it just was falling totally flat, because then what really started to kind of clue me into this was I would start joining calls much earlier in that process. And in that business, I was really kind of the subject matter expert as far as Marketo went. And people would light up at that point, right? And so we just weren't introducing expertise early enough within the sales process. And so it really started to open my eyes to this is a different type of seller. This is a hybrid between solution consultant, still has the growth mentality and the not coin operated, but you know what I mean, mindset of wanting to perform, wanting to achieve, but also could have an intelligent conversation very early within the sales funnel. And it's surprising because it sounds like a no-brainer, but like I had gotten on so many calls when I was sitting in a VP, SVP of marketing seat, as well as sales, where you're getting those early qualifications, like basically the pushing people away, like, are you really qualified to buy this platform? It's a complete turnoff, right? Like you just want your questions answered super early on in that process. You want to see a path to value, and you want to understand what the right solution is. And so that's what really sparked that outreach was, the need to retool that team. We had gone through kind of, I think before you came on board, an iteration of that, but our team was largely still software sales folks. And so we were doing a great job at lining up business. At that point, we had pivoted away from the initial sales team. We were getting a ton of traction at that point, but there was a big disconnect between what we were selling and the expectations of the clients. So it was the age-old, like, rose-colored glasses. Yeah, we'll do that for $25K. And then we would end up with a less than optimal client experience. So we needed to fully pull in what I would consider to be someone more balanced on the sales consulting side that still had those kind of sales DNA to them. So, and I think we found the right fit in that regard. Selling to marketers is just a different bag, and that took a lot of pain to learn that.
So if I think back to where we were and where we are now, one of the most interesting things to me is in a services consulting type of business, you typically see as much as maybe 90% of revenues coming from your existing customer base.
Right.
And, I've talked to friends at Accenture and KPMG, and that number is not that far off.
In fact, I talked to someone at Accenture the other day, and they have no net new business quota any longer. At least within I'm sure someone's listening is like, that's bullshit. Like, listen, the guy I talked to said that all of their reps are incentivized about growth within key strategic accounts, right? And so that definitely echoes that focus, but it also, the reason we built the business the way that we did is we had no client base. Like, remember, like going back to day one, this was an idea of a market need that really I had identified by sitting within that seat and talking to enough marketers to know that other people have that problem. But we didn't have a big anchor client that we were starting off with. Like, we literally had to kill everything that we ate. So that is the typical agency model, right? And that's why I still have a problem today, even in talking about shift paradigm in terms of, are we a consultancy? Are we an agency? Are we something else? Because quite frankly, we do all of those things, but we don't rest on the expansion motion. It's a super important motion for us, but that's the predominant motion is how do we find more of those great clients and then continue to grow them? That's the key lever in the business.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is in the early days, we had almost the opposite problem.
Yeah.
We were really good at acquisition, and we had a hell of a time expanding beyond deal one.
Yep.
We tried different roles and this and that. Why do you think that was, when that seems like such a natural pivot point for a consulting business?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting market dynamics at play there. Like, probably number one, the fact that RevOps is so misunderstood from the most fundamental levels, the executive level, the board level, right? Like, it largely is still looked upon as a skill set that can be easily learned and that is fairly turnkey. Meaning that, and it was even easier within those days than it is today, where, you had an MA platform and that was it in a CRM. Nowadays, you've got these stacks that are incredibly opinionated, incredibly complex, and still, I think the respect is not there for revenue operations. But that was so. I think we did something really good in the early days of the business that also bit us in the butt, but it was a natural evolution. It was a problem that we had to see, which was productization of services. And again, I'm not from a services background. Largely, services around marketing automation also didn't exist at the time. And so pricing and the total ASP for those types of services was totally up in the air. So we priced them at what we felt was fair. I think it was on the lower end of the market at the time, not really intentionally, but the way we were pricing services, the way that we were productizing services, and again, this had to happen because at that point, no one knew what it was to implement marketing automation, to implement Marketo, to implement lead scoring. Like, we broke each one of those functions down and created what we called at the time service packs. And they were essentially lists of tasks and delivery criteria. And so when you package these together, that became the product that we sold. It was highly contained because we had to train people on this. We had to get them to understand, this very misunderstood or just virgin area of the landscape. And that served its purpose. But to your point, we started acquiring, hundreds and eventually even thousands of clients, and then not attaching anything as a secondary motion. We were very focused on acquisition, obviously, but the way that we productized things made it seem very rigidy and very turnkey. So it served that purpose. But then when the business needed to evolve, we needed to move beyond those kind of rigid constraints. And fortunately, talent in the market had kind of caught up to where it needed to be at that point, to where we could hire folks that knew what they were doing around the platforms and start to train them on other aspects, which is how does underlying process and how does marketing strategy and go-to-market motions really not only inform, but our dependencies for success with those platforms. And so that's where we started to kind of expand the business and probably most importantly, package at least those concepts at the initial time of sale. Even if someone didn't buy them initially, they knew that we performed those services and felt they were critical to success. And therefore we started to see more attachment and expansion beyond just that implementation or the optimization of that platform.
The packaging of services not only help from a delivery standpoint, but if I try to put myself back almost 10 years and think of jumping into the business that it is today, it would be completely overwhelming.
Totally.
I don't know how long it would take me to ramp to sell who we are today versus 10 years ago because of the packaging. It gave it that productized feel.
And nowadays, if you go look at any startup in the RevOps consulting space, they're doing what we did 10 years
Correct.
ago. Their
100%.
pricing page, number one, has pricing on it, as ours did, and it's 1, 2, 3, right? It's your typical software matrix, good, better, best. And like that's become kind of the model for introducing services in that space. Again, I had no idea what I was doing. I came from software. That's what I know. So I structured a services business like that. And in some areas, like you're mentioning, in terms of expansion and ultimate customer lifetime value, we didn't serve ourselves as well as we could, but we almost had to go through that productization just to define the market and really, to your point, get something that our sellers could understand, our delivery teams could understand. They could come together in the middle and know that what we sold is what we're going to deliver on. If I had gone into that with a more typical agency mentality to where things are T&M, and I shouldn't gloss over the fact we charge like software. In fact, in many ways, we still do today, where you paid up front, you paid for a subscription to a retainer or an implementation or a project, and we got that commitment, we build that up front. That's a symptom of cash flow in those days, right? Like this is all coming out of my pocket. So I wanted to get receivables up front. But if we had done T&M, we never would have been able to achieve that degree of understanding between what we're selling and what we're delivering. And I still think a lot of agencies shoot themselves in the foot by having kind of those looser structures because, and a lot of agencies also only sell one product. We're selling many, many products. But that productization was absolutely necessary to get that understanding. The cash flow component of it was great. And, again, it's a maturity curve. It led us to a point where we could expand those services. And, as you mentioned, nowadays we offer, end to end, like true, strategic insight-led services that compete with the best of your large global consultancies out there. But we also have not lost the roots in, all right, here's how we support the operationalization of those strategies. And that is where productization still resides and still has a huge amount of benefit.
I think it was a huge advantage for us in the early days when you think about it, even from a sales perspective, right? Having that mentality of a software company. Mm-hmm. Because let's face it, software companies, acquisition is what matters. It's how they get their valuations. Mm-hmm. It's all of these types of things. That's starting to mature as well.
Sure.
But in those days, it was very much about new logo,
Yep.
new logo. But it gave us an edge in terms of, I had two of our other guys, Reed and Paul, on the show.
Yep.
That's coming up, and we talked about selling to and through software companies. If we didn't have that mentality, I don't think those people that we were trying to essentially sell to help get them to bring us deals
Yep.
would have appreciated It's the same
Well,
mentality as
the
them,
most
right?
difficult thing for, someone sitting in that seat, someone who's carrying a bag for software and they know enablement services are critical for the success of their product. What's the first question everyone asks? What are your products? What do you sell? Right?
Exactly
Like
right.
what can I take to my end user and feel confident that that's what they need in order to succeed? And the consulting answer to that is it depends. Which, sure, right? Like we're dealing with incredibly variable landscapes. You got to take into account who the client is, what their go-to-market model is, what their existing environment looks like, the roles, the teams, the skill sets, all of that is super relevant. But at the end of the day, people need a hook to latch onto. And still, when we have conversations with new partners today, it's like, what's the 3 bullet points I can give to my team, right? And it gets harder and harder to articulate as your services expand, but you have to maintain that focus. Like, you have to be able to tell people, this is what we do, this is why it's relevant to you, and this is why it's going to make your customers successful.
Yeah, so you talked earlier about that hybrid of the person that needed to sit in that seat had to be somewhat of an early stage consultant, but also a seller. So for me personally, what was awesome was having that SaaS mentality where I could pick up on those things because I had never worked in that. Right. I'd always worked in services. So I was able to bring more of the consulting side, but some of that rigidity and drive and urgency and some of those things you just had to be in the seat to learn were really, really foundational in those early days. And again, unless you're going to go work in a high volume SaaS company, you're probably not going to learn that type of thing. So it was really an interesting way to learn through an agency or consulting standpoint.
Productization in my mind is just so critical as it pertains to services. Like things that I even took for granted when you start to get exposure to, like businesses and so on. Like we were running, at the time of acquisition, my balance sheet had one account on it that was over 30 days delinquent on an invoice. And it was a large global client that always pays net 60, no matter what the contract says, right? But they were going to pay it. Like that is so rare. And if there was one thing I wish I would have just kind of focused on from my own sanity perspective, is really kind of relishing in the things that productization accomplished within our business. Because it like when folks looked at that, they're like, this can't be it, right? Like, no, it is. And we bill up front and our clients pay and they're happy. And like, it just created so much mutual understanding against for every party involved, certainly sales, as you're highlighting. Again, if there's one critical factor to doing what we did within that business and are continuing to do here, I think it's squarely that. It's productization, it's repeatability, taking into account the variability in the market, right? That's always going to be the it depends, but at the fundamental, you have to have some structures that everyone latches onto and says, this is what this looks like within our environment.
Yeah, one of the things it created is, as an example, right? I remember getting into competitive conversations with organizations we knew we'd be going head to head with in those early days. And the productization allowed us to confidently say, you're going to get this methodology delivered this way, no matter who you talk to.
Right.
If someone's sick, goes on vacation, God forbid, leaves the company, the next person who slides into that slot, you're going to get the same thing. And what we heard over and over again on the other side of the market was, whoever was sitting in the seat at a client that they poached from, you're going to get their methodology.
Right.
And then if they have to slot someone else in, you're going to get their point of view from another thing. So, like you said, RevOps was super mature at the time. We were almost creating the gold standard for what it was.
Well, it's funny. I think everyone that would have been involved with this is now gone from Marketo/Adobe. But when they started putting together their internal ProServe, so if anyone knows the history of Marketo, they largely did not have a ProServe until I think 2014, 2015, somewhere around in there. We gave them our playbook at that point. We gave them all of our products, all of our service packs, and said, this is what we hold, this is our standard. This is what we include within these different service products. And so, of course, there were differences in what they ultimately lit on. It was far more focused on just the technical implementation of the software. But that really was the foundation of those service offerings, right? What they ultimately called launch packs at that point. So yeah, I mean, again, it's just so critical in a space that's highly immature, where you're not only struggling for talent, you are creating talent, which is literally what we did for the first 5-6 years of that business. Take people that had been on the client side, bring them into consulting. It was almost better when it was that way versus someone working at a like services based org, because they had all those kind of, I wouldn't even term them bad habits. They're just habits we didn't want. We wanted people to understand that, like, hey, consistency is so critical here. Here's our standard of excellence, not only in relation to how we structure our services, but to your point, what is our methodology? What are our true best practices around what we recommend for scoring in B2B versus B2C considered purchase, right? So that wealth of tribal knowledge and formalizing that in the portable form of best practices, absolutely number 2 in terms of secret sauce.
What was the joke circa 2016, 2017? If you made it for a year at LeadMD, you were going to get your salary doubled somewhere else, right? Like you were client side, you're going to write your ticket. So, and that certainly happened for a lot of folks.
And I won't take full credit for that. Like if there's one thing that I squarely throw at Miss Andrea Lechner-Becker's feet, it is rigidity of excellence. And I think that worked out super well with what we're trying to do from a growth and a productization perspective. You have to back that up with great consultants and just, be as hard-nosed and as driving as possible in terms of upholding that standard. And you're absolutely correct. Like there are many, many people that have gone on to super successful positions that did not cut it within LeadMD. And I am super proud of that fact. I'm equally proud of the fact the folks that were great, that were rock stars there, they all went on to do something better as a result. Even though we are a small consultancy in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is by anything but a tech hotbed of talent, right? And we had a lot of remote folks, I won't discount that, but the way that we onboarded, the way that we ran people through that kind of internal certification process, I think it certainly in those years was second to none.
Well, this trip down memory lane has been good. So let's pivot to one last topic before I let you go, and the current state of the market. I think we're starting to see some shifting. How do you see the current state impacting the sales environment right now?
Well, I think we got a great litmus test and trial by fire with COVID, right? Any sort of market variability is gonna lend itself to this, but we've been, frankly, in such a rich environment since 2009, let's call it, right? Probably 2010 by the time we were fully out of the 2008 insanity, where new was so sexy and budgets kind of opened up. And frankly, the underlying driver of all of that was the fact that marketing teams were spending so much outsourcing almost every piece of their day-to-day functionality, right? Agencies and consultancies, like all the performance was outsourced to those folks. The advent of marketing and sales technology now put that responsibility on the heads of internal marketing talent. You're going to use this platform to drive demand, to generate awareness, to move people, help move people through the funnel along with sales. And that was a huge economic benefit for those organizations, right? Now we've come to expect that, right? And so I think that just general market excitement has waned to now there's a different problem, which is we've invested in all this technology and we're not getting the performance that we want. So that wave was already starting to crest. What COVID and then ultimately what are, in my opinion, financial repercussions of COVID and of over-indexing on cheap money, we won't get into that, but what that has now led to is just an absolute, and the pendulum shift has swung all the way to the other side in a breakneck fashion to hyper value. Like you better be able to demonstrate that not only you are aware of the key KPIs and key drivers that client organization needs to produce, but that you are, if not the determining factor, a major determining factor in hitting those KPIs. So, the curtain is lifted at this point. Every organization is being evaluated on, are they a mission critical spend for us on our balance sheet? And you've seen this, like we've got deals that have gone through marketing, that have gone through executive, and they're now at a special budgetary commission, right? That reviewing is this mission critical? What will we get? What is the spend? What are the contract nuances? If something hits the fan, can we bail out of it, right? Like they're looking at all these different dimensions because there's uncertainty out there, and people want to obviously bet on something that is as certain as possible. And so this is the rubber meets the road time for sales orgs, for folks acquiring clients. You have to be looking through the client's lens and representing their interest and aligning your service, your solution, whatever it is, as a critical factor. If you can't look at that and say, we drove X, whatever that KPI was for that client, you are not going to exist on that P&L. And for far too long, we've seen, certainly within the SaaS motion, customer success as largely an afterthought. Acquisition was the main fuel there. And we measured users, we measured activity in the system, we measured, how well are they adopting the platform as a proxy for impact. There is no proxy for impact other than what the client is putting on that board slide at the end of the month to say, we hit this in relation to our OKRs, our goals, our KPIs. Your organization has to be a contributing factor to that success.
All right, Justin, this has been great. So I'm going to get the elevator pitch here. How does Shift Paradigm help companies fight the current market dynamic? This is your time to shine.
Yeah, so I think we did something really interesting right around 2017 where we started looking at the entire organization through the lens of what we call outcomes, which is squarely what I just talked about. What does the client need to accomplish? What is the KPI? What are our prescribed deliverables that are going to produce that KPI? But that is essentially a lead in our, even from a system perspective, but probably more importantly, how we talk and articulate those projects internally. It's a reaction to what I'm sure everyone in a service-based business has run into, where you walk out on the floor, these days virtually, ask a consulting team, what are you working on? They provide you a description of the deliverables they're producing. They don't talk in terms of the client's desired outcome. What is that objective that they're driving towards? So I truly believe that, beyond what we've talked about here as early days secret sauce, going forward, outcomes are the secret sauce of this organization. We have to be talking in the language of our clients. Their performance has to be the way that we think about our success. And every eyeball in the company has to be looking at, just as importantly as bookings, just as importantly as revenue, just as importantly as billing utilization, have to be looking at how are we impacting the businesses of our clients in a highly tangible way that everyone has a shared definition around. So that's my pitch.
Amazing. So for those of you listening, whether you are selling products, services, there's a lot of really good takeaways here that apply across the board. So the first thing I learned is don't fight the market. It's really hard.
Not if you want me to be in the battle with you.
Right? It's really hard to re-educate. The second thing is understand the buyer. And what we just heard is more importantly, the buyer's outcome.
Totally.
And that'll help you align with them. And then the third is find the path to value, if not hyper value, as quickly as possible.
Totally. I mean, if your buyer isn't thinking about their relationship with you in the same sentence as they're thinking about their KPI that they own, their path to getting a raise. If they're not thinking, oh man, Shift Paradigm is killing it for us this quarter, this year, whatever it is, then I think you're behind the eight ball there.
All right. Well, you can find Justin on LinkedIn. He's very active, has some fun stuff to take a look at, especially if
at least inflammatory stuff.
Especially if he gets his boys Ted Purcell and Craig Rosenberg involved in the conversation. It gets really entertaining. You can also find Shift Paradigm on the web at shiftparadigm.com. Thanks for listening.